Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. This week we're talking to Uzbekistan's most prominent writer, Hamid Ismailov. Award-winning and widely appreciated in the West for his unique prose that blends Eastern and Western traditions, Ismailov is hardly a household name in his native Uzbekistan. He fled the country in 1992 following harsh repressions and a crackdown on democratic opposition under then-President Islam Karimov, and he hasn't been allowed back since. We all know that Uzbekistan's authorities aren't exactly known for their sophistication, and I don't expect them to appreciate good literature. But Ismailov is arguably the most famous and certainly the most interesting living Uzbek writer. What makes this even more remarkable is that after all these years abroad, he still writes in Uzbek. Banning someone like that is, well, not very smart. Today I'm speaking with Hamid about his new book, We Computers, which follows John Peirce, a French poet and psychologist who in the 1980s discovers a computer and teaches it not only to accumulate and analyze all existing literature, but also to generate it. The book has been described as a ghazal novel. What does that mean? Hamid will explain it himself. By way of introduction, for those of you who don't know him yet, Hamid Ismailov is an Uzbek writer, a longtime BBC and Radio Free Europe journalist, and the author of numerous works of fiction and poetry in several languages. He's also the recipient of the EBRD Literature Prize for his novel The Devil's Dance, sometimes called an Uzbek Game of Thrones. His latest novel, We Computers, has been longlisted for the 2025 National Book Awards for Translated Literature, one of the most prestigious literary prizes in the United States. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi Hamid, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me.
We're meeting today because you recently published a book titled We Computers, and you and your translator have called it a ghazal novel. What is it exactly? A ghazal novel, basically.
Yeah, because the main character is, one of the main characters of the novel is Hafiz, the ultimate master of ghazal. Ghazal is the love song which was introduced by the Arab poets, but then it came to and flourished among the Persian poets and Turkic poets as well. And the secret of flourishing, especially in Persian and in Turkic world, is the language, Persian and Turkic, which is SOV language, subject, object, verb. And in ghazal, the last place of every verse is the most active one. And it fits exactly the structure of the Persian language and the Turkic languages. So it's so beautifully crafted. Usually ghazal is a love song between beloved and lover. So lover is sending his message of love to beloved. And both in Persian and Turkic, she might be he as well. There is no gender. And when, for example, a poet says about his beloved, so it might be her, a woman, it might be him, sort of young man, or it might be an absolute, he with capital H. In that sense, there is this wonderful ambiguity which is sort of forming ghazal. And apart from that, in every ghazal, there are different forces helping the lover to achieve the beloved or putting obstacles against him. So with this novel, I used this technique or this structure as a structure of the very novel.
Your book is brilliant. It has so many references to poetry, literature, and so many overlaying tales. And one of the themes that appear over again in the book is the question of authorship. In the Sufi tradition, which your literature is often referring to, there is an idea of accumulated knowledge which was created by God or it belongs to God. And the question of authorship is not as important as in the Western tradition. Now you compare this Sufi tradition and this idea of accumulated knowledge to AI. So something that is a completely recent and a new invention, but also similarly to the Sufi tradition, puts us in a situation where there is no authorship, but there is an accumulated knowledge that everyone can use or anyone can benefit from. How do you see it as an author? It's very interesting how the whole idea of AI will impact our work as authors. What brought you to discussing this and to comparing these two seemingly completely different traditions?
Actually, I don't have the final answers for anything as any human being, but I am sort of putting a point to discuss in a way. The concept which you're referring as a Sufi one generally is an Islamic one. For example, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, so he was an uneducated man. And somehow he connected to this treasure of knowledge, to this well of knowledge, and brought it to humankind. So in Islamic tradition, he is just a prophet. And in Quran, he says very often, I'm just the warner and messenger. But all knowledge is coming from Allah or from God. So basically, this tradition makes us, in a way, just the transmitters. And the latest psychological theories are showing as well that there is kind of wealth of knowledge beyond us, and our mind is somehow might connect to this knowledge. Sufis, as you are saying, they were mastering the art of reaching that one by cleansing their heart, and when the heart is absolutely pure, they would reach this knowledge which just comes to them. Knowledge of all kinds, knowledge about stones, knowledge about plants, knowledge about stars. They would know everything. So it very strongly reminds the AI as well, as the wealth of knowledge, as the pool of knowledge, which could be used by anyone just to connect to it and start to use. So that is maybe the idea which is to be discussed in a way, how we are going to commercialize or allow people to be the consumers of this knowledge which was created by people. I mean, when you compare us to the size of universe, we are small thing, and we have to live as a humankind, as one family in a way, because the challenge of this universe is so strong, and we are tribalizing everything, we are fighting each other. It's time to understand to humankind that in the face of this gigantic universe, we are one family.
Your book, just like your previous book, feels so close to what you called an Islamic tradition and the Persian and the Eastern tradition of literature and poetry. Is this tradition closer to Uzbek culture than the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? How did this happen that you chose this path in literature? Because it's very uncommon to read books like yours in the West. And I wonder if it was maybe a decolonial exercise on your part. I'm talking about the time when you started writing.
I wrote in different traditions, in different styles. So every book I'm trying to write in a style which fits this particular book. And as for the Islamic roots of mine, for example, yes, I come from very religious family, which happened to be an Islamic one. I might have been born in a Buddhist family or in a Christian or Jewish family. So by default, I was born to Islamic family, and therefore I'm keeping these traditions of my forefathers kind of alive in my writing. But at the same time, I'm not doing it dominant or overwhelmingly visible against other things. For example, AI is the product of the West in a way. It's interesting how the different narratives coexist in this world. Generally, I would define my literature as the composition or juxtaposition of different narratives. In a way, if you want, so this book is meta-postmodern in a way, because, for example, postmodernism is working with the citations, with the references to different cultures, different times and epochs. I'm working with the texts, different texts. For example, in this particular novel, I can use, for example, a part from Baburnameh of Babur, let's say, or, for example, something from Verlaine, let's say, or Apollinaire, and so on and so forth. So I'm using all these existing texts as AI would be doing. Generally, this particular novel is written as if it's written by the machines, which are taking everything at their disposal, because the internet is boundless, so they're taking different text and they are making a pastiche of different narratives rather than different citations and so on and so forth. So that is where, for example, Islamic parts are coming together with other parts, with other mystical, with Kabbalistic, with Tao, and all other sort of mystical things as well as with rational ones, the ultimate form of which is AI.
Still, when I read your book, this one and also some previous ones, there is this feeling that it is an Eastern novel. And I'm sure that you do it on purpose, right? So you are using this Eastern tradition, I think, or maybe I'm wrong, to somehow refer back to your roots. Do you think that the Uzbek tradition is closer to the Islamic and Persian literature than Dostoevsky, even though it was colonized by Russia for so many years and you basically were born in the Soviet Union? So what I'm trying to say is that it's actually interesting that you chose to go the path of, let's say, Eastern tradition rather than the, let's say, Soviet rationalist tradition in writing and literature.
Maybe because, you read the translations of my Uzbek books, maybe, because I'm writing it in Uzbek, and with the age, I discovered that we are writing not for particular, at least me, and not for particular reader or audiences, but to the language. We are challenging language, we're developing language, we are finding new riches of the language, rediscovering it, we are renovating it, all of that. So in that sense, those things which I'm writing in Uzbek, they are challenging the sort of, the existing Uzbek language and Uzbek culture, Uzbek mentality. So, for example, I've got several novels in Uzbek where there are no Uzbeks as such. So there are different characters, but no Uzbeks, for example. When I'm writing in Russian, obviously, within this language, I have to refer to what you are saying, to Dostoevsky, to Pushkin, to Gogol, to Nabokov, to Brodsky, to Mandelstam, Akhmatova, everyone, because language is always echoing with someone else who spoke the same, who gave you this language in a way. It's echoing and constantly sort of finding those voices within yourself. There is a famous saying that a lion lion consists of sheep which he has eaten. So the same is with the writer. So the writer's mind consists of books he read, characters he met in these books, his relationship with these characters, and generally with culture, with different cultures, so be it Soviet culture, be it Uzbek culture, and so on and so forth. So I think it depends on the language which you are writing. And they might be looking Eastern, because I'm writing into Uzbek. I'm never writing into English unless I'm writing in English. It's just the translators who are adopting it for their readership. But my primary task is to debate, to raise, to challenge the issues of this particular language, of this particular mentality and culture.
Before we move to the Uzbek language, which I would like to talk about too, I would like to briefly ask you about your work with your translator, because I read a note from your translator at the end of the book, and I could tell from what she wrote that it was a very, very difficult task for her to translate your books for a number of reasons. One of them being that you use literature and poems from loads of different languages, that some things have been translated, some things haven't, that the style is changing, that the style is also so important in your book that it's a very difficult and also responsible task to relay it in a way that reflects the way you wrote it in the original. Can you tell me how you work with a translator and how long does it take to translate a book like this? Because I know that this is not the first time she translated your book.
Yes, that's true. And I'm immensely grateful to her, because unfortunately, I never think about translators when I'm writing the original. As I said earlier, I'm challenging myself in all senses, For example, in the style, in the musicality, in the tonality of the language. So every time I'm trying to create a new language for new relationship, for new realities, for new book, basically. Every time, if I'm repeating myself, I tore apart the manuscript and I start afresh. So, the joy of challenging the language, because we are the servants of this language, we are the people who are maintaining this language, like, for example, the sort of engineers are maintaining the mechanism, let's say, in order to this mechanism survives, lives longer, and so on and so forth. So the same is with writers and languages. And therefore, I never think about the horrible task of translators to find the same kind of relationships or the same kind of subtleties in their own language. It's a horrible sadistic thing in a way what I'm doing towards my translators. And I'm eternally grateful to them because they are doing an excellent job.
I can imagine that must be painful, and I could basically feel pain from your translator's note in the end. Tell me, you left Uzbekistan in 1992. And this was the time of Islam Karimov, so the beginning of the ruthless dictatorship. And you haven't been back ever since in terms of living in Uzbekistan. And basically most of your readers are based abroad. You are a person knowing and writing in multiple languages. Why you still write in Uzbek, even though your literature is not widely read or widely known in Uzbekistan? I was actually quite surprised that whenever I spoke to to people in Uzbekistan and I mentioned your name, the majority of them, even the kind of open-minded and educated ones and maybe pro-Western, didn't really know your work, which was really sad because I think that they should be proud of having such an amazing author among their compatriots. So why you still keep on writing in the Uzbek language, even though so few people read your books in the original?
Maybe I find an excuse when I'm saying that we are writing not for the audiences or readers, but we are writing into language. So maybe it's an excuse, maybe it's a lame excuse, but I do believe in it. Even if you have one reader, one sincere and real reader, and I've got this kind of reader in Uzbekistan, one of the most prominent and one of the best writers of Uzbekistan, Erkin Agzamov, is an ardent reader of my books. Yesterday, I was telling him all our life we are reading each other's books, and that was the meaning of our life, you know. I'm reading his books, he is reading my books, so we are cross-pollinating each other in a way. No, as I'm saying, you know, the challenges of the language are immense, you know. Language is living thing. For example, what was written by Navai, let's say, or even by Abdullah Qadri, nowadays it doesn't describe the reality of today in a way. So you have to find a modern language every time. I've got a saying, for every Tolkien there is J.K. Rowling, you know, with every generation there must be something like that. So in that sense, there is plenty of things to discover in Uzbek, especially in modern Uzbek, let's say, of nowadays Uzbek. But I'm writing in Russian as well, I'm writing in English whenever it's needed. I'm writing in small languages, small things like poems and so on and so forth. So I'm serving different languages.
And how do you get in touch with modern Uzbek? Because you don't live in Uzbekistan. So how do you get to know how the language is changing? What are you reading in the Uzbek language? And also, are there any words that you had to come up with in order to be able to describe something in the Uzbek language?
The answer is yes, with the discoveries and with introducing different words. So there are two things. When I compare, for example, my experience of living abroad with, let's say, different generations, let's say Nabokov's generation. Nabokov was, in a way, in isolation from the language which was happening or which was developing in the Soviet Union, yeah? And therefore, you can feel when you are reading Nabokov that he is still modernizing by the tools of the 19th century. So he is not aware of what is happening in the live language. Nowadays, with the internet, with social media, you are sort of, you know, aware of everything, every trend in the language. So it's so easy to catch up with the things which are happening in the language, one thing. Secondly, I was blessed to be a journalist as well for the time of my life when I was abroad. You know, initially I worked for the BBC 25 years, then I worked for Radio Liberty for 5 years. So it gave me a chance to keep in touch with what's happening in your country and see it through the lenses of an outsider as well. So you've got the best of two worlds, you know. On the one hand, you are connected. On the other hand, you are not too immersed in this life, in this language. So you can compare, you can analyze, see what is happening in Kazakh, in Kyrgyz, in Karakalpak, in Turkmen, in Azeri, in Turkish, and maybe to take some of the nice things which are happening in those languages into, let's say, Uzbek or vice versa.
So are there any particular words that you introduced to Uzbek and, for example, they started being used by other people?
While we work in journalism, so we introduced many, many words into modern Uzbek, endlessly. But I'll tell you another very interesting discovery which I made while living in Czech Republic. So in Uzbek, there is a word manjalaka, which is about, how to put it mildly, about an open woman, let's say, yeah, loose cannon, kind of. It doesn't exist in the classical dictionaries of the medieval time. It appeared somewhere, apparently, in the beginning of the 20th century. And when I came to Czech Republic, I realized that manželka and manželka means the wife, in Czech. It's the same word. Basically, what has happened during the First World War time, 400,000 prisoners of war, especially from Central Europe, from Austro-Hungarian Empire, let's say, were sent to Central Asia. And obviously, there were people with their wives, with manželkas, and European women at that time looked to sort of, open to the local population. And manželka became manželach, for example. Yes. So when you're comparing, traveling, learning different cultures, you discover many things in your own culture as well.
That's a brilliant story. And tell me, because obviously you are observing what is happening in Uzbekistan when it comes to literature. Do you see any interesting new young writers writing in Uzbek? Because I have a feeling that, I lived in Uzbekistan for 3 years, and fortunately I don't live there anymore, but I'm still kind of observing what is happening there. So I have a feeling that for many years, people in Uzbekistan were okay with the fact that some literature is just in Russian. And I wonder if anything has changed recently, or if you have seen anyone who would challenge this assumption and who would maybe start creating in the Uzbek language. We also know that the Uzbek authorities in general, they haven't really made that much effort to focus on the Uzbek language, to promote the Uzbek language, to promote the Uzbek literature. But maybe something is changing. Maybe you see some sort of glimmers of hope on the Uzbek market.
I was always amazed by the grace of God sending talents to Uzbek land, because authorities are doing everything to banish any literature, any talent, and nonetheless, when you're thinking that nothing is working to create the talents appear one after another. So, generally speaking, obviously, Uzbek poetry is much stronger than Uzbek prose. There are young poets, wonderful poets, like, for example, Tillen Isak, like John Tamer John Dor, there are Khurshid, there are plenty of young, wonderful poets. I explain the strength of the poetry. Usually in traditional societies where there is no information, there are lots of emotions. Angst, fear, all of that, which are creating the poetry in a way, which are the basis of the poetry. All these emotions are then boiling into the poetry. But the prose requires much more rational thinking apart from everything else. And unfortunately, prose is weaker than poetry. Nonetheless, there are many names for young prose writers as well. For example, abroad, some female prose writers are appearing, like Shahadat Ulugova, who is writing novel after a novel. There is another writer, female writer, Shahzoda Samarkandi, who writes in Tajik, but she is abroad as well. When you are living in the country, you are under lots of pressures of authorities, of union of writers, of your peers, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, that curtails the talents and the creativity of writing people. In poetry, it's easier to be personal, but in prose, it's more difficult.
Do you know if your books are still banned in Uzbekistan, or they are simply not sold or not published by the leading publishing houses?
I know it by default when Karimov died between 30th of August and 2nd of September, in some period of that time. On the 5th of September, a group of people sent my novel, which was published online, The Devil's Dance, into the print, while there was uncertainty with the authorities in Uzbekistan. And they succeeded without any prior knowledge of mine, or any consent of mine. They succeeded to print 1,000 copies of that one, which immediately became a rarity. And a particular person who published this book once answered on Facebook when people were asking why you don't publish more copies of this book or other books of this author. He said, you have to have the heart of the horse in order to publish it. So apparently there is still sort of ban. Otherwise, they would have published.
When did you last travel to Uzbekistan? When was the last time you've been to your home country?
So infamously in 2017, as a part of the BBC delegation, which should have met with the officials of foreign ministry, I flew to Uzbekistan. Everyone from the delegation was allowed into Uzbekistan. I was deported. So that was the last time when I tried to come to Uzbekistan. Before that, I crossed Uzbekistan when one of our journalists in Tajikistan was arrested. So I crossed Uzbekistan to Khojan. Urimboy Usman was arrested, and to discuss with the authorities to release him, I crossed Uzbekistan in 2010.
Why do you think the authorities are afraid of a writer? Or what is it about your literature and your work as a journalist as well that makes you so unpopular with Uzbekistan's authorities?
I thought quite a lot about that one, and my latest explanation is it's journalism. One of the sort of instigators of my deportation might have been, when President Mirziyoyev came to power, he came to power anti-constitutionally, because by the constitution, the power after the death of the president should have gone to the Speaker of the Parliament. There's a matter of legal constitutional point. I made it on the BBC television, on the world television. So maybe that was the thing which made the current president offended or whatever. I just stated the constitutional fact that power should have gone to the Speaker of the Parliament, but not to the Prime Minister. So maybe that one. But once again, it's like finding black cat in the dark room,
So yeah, the Uzbek authorities never forget and never forgive. That's something that I also know quite well. And what does Hamid, a man, and Hamid, a poet, miss most about Uzbekistan?
First of all, when I came in 2017, I've agreed with a friend of mine, the same writer, which I mentioned earlier, that he meets me in the airport and we go to the graveyard of my mother. So just see the graveyard of my mother. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it for 15 years. Maybe that is.
You have been through some really difficult times in Uzbekistan. You were a victim of repressions by the state. What was the reason why in the beginning the Karimov regime and now Mirziyoyev are fighting against the opposition, are fighting against people like you, journalists, Democrats? Like, what is the thinking behind this? I mean, obviously, this is an authoritarian regime. Obviously, it's about power. It's about not being challenged. But do you think that maybe there is something else behind it? Or you think that this is just to keep the power?
Generally, any authoritarian regime is against freedom of thinking, free thinking, basically. When you're thinking freely, you are becoming subversive because you are seeing and saying the things which are in reality, which are happening in reality, whereas the so-called reality of the authorities is always different, They try to make you believe that you are living the best of any lives, under their sort of leadership and so on and so forth. So all this idea of Renaissance, the third Renaissance, and so on and so forth. But what about the million of the migrants which are making ends in Russia under the sort of, duress to be sent to Ukraine to fight or to be imprisoned and so on and so forth? What about this? What about the ladies who are forced to become prostitutes, in Thailand, in India, or in Dubai, for example, because they can't make their ends in Uzbekistan? What is about all of that, So when you are raising these issues, obviously you are becoming subversive.
Are you working on anything right now? Can you tell our listeners if you're working on another novel, and if so, in what language, and can we know what it's about?
Usually I work from the clock change to clock change, sort of October-ish to April, let's say, when the long hours of evening allow me to sit for a couple of hours every day or every night and write something. So usually last several years, I used to write one novel per season in a way, kind of. But this particular last year, I was overproductive. I wrote 3 novels. One is kind of thinking about the difference between AI and human consciousness, human mind, on the basis of this time is purely on the Sufi basis of Fariduddin Attar. Alisher Nawai has got the paraphrase of his Conference of Bird, which is called Kushtile, the language of birds. I wrote a novel which is called Tushtile, the language of the dreams, so which stands against the AI and linear thinking, kind of. But that is the novel. Then I wrote a novel because you were asking me about my Soviet upbringing. So when I was 6 or 5 years old, I clandestinely read one of the novels on the shelf of my mother. It was a second class novel by the Soviet writer Matveyev, and it's called Tarantul. It's about the Leningrad's blockade and so on and so forth. But I was 6, 7 years old, and how this book affected my mind, how it sort of, filled it with the Soviet type of propaganda, and how I was cleansing my mind of all of that. So it's a novel which is called Tarantul's Bite. So I wrote it after the Tushtile, and the third novel which I wrote, it was about the unfinished things of myself. When I was young, I used to start the projects and never end them. And now thinking about these works, all of a sudden I found the logic inside of it, why I couldn't write this particular thing, why I stopped, and I shifted to another thing which I didn't finish it up as well. So I found a wonderful logic, very, very interesting logic, why it happened. So I used these fragments of my youth writing and wrote another novel, why some particular things are not finished. That was the third novel. So I wrote, as you see, 3 novels in one, So now I'm resting now.
Okay, that's a lot. And tell me, is it possible to read those other novels that you wrote last year anywhere? Have they been published?
Not yet. So they are still waiting because I've got many novels which are not translated, which are not published. So I was indulging myself in a way. As you are seeing, these all 3 novels are sort of, kind of rediscovering yourself in a way, but rediscovering yourself in a wider context, which might be interesting for others as well. How the boy is becoming a Soviet product, for example, and how he dis-Sovietized himself, for example. It's a huge issue, though it's a sort of particular case study, but it's a huge issue. Or unfinished works, for example. All of us, we've got plenty of unfinished works, but we never think why we didn't finish, what were the blocks, So sometimes we explain it through the Freudism or Jungism and so on and so forth, but we never think through. But there are plenty of interesting things, within the human psychology, which are to be rediscovered.
Actually, I was planning to finish our conversation here, but you said something extremely interesting that I would like to ask you a bit more about. So, de-Sovietizing yourself, is this something that you've achieved or you are still in the process? And what does it mean, really?
It's an interesting question, and it's impossible to sort of desovietize yourself completely, because there are some features which you cherish, for example, because you were young at that time. Some are interesting, and so on and so forth. But for example, this book shows certain things, like, for example, all the main positive characters are purely Russians. Negative characters in these books are either Balts, Jewish people, or Ukrainians, or Tatars, and so on and so forth. So, can I rediscover it within myself, for example? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. So there are things like that which are obvious, which were brainwashed me when I was a young boy, because I wanted to be a Russian as well, in my the childhood, because every positive person was Ivan Vasilievich or Stepan Grigorievich. So I wanted to be as well. And all of us, we used to have, instead of Hamid, for example, Khariton or Russian versions of our names. So is it a Soviet product? Yes, it is a Soviet. Have I succeeded to cleanse it up? Yes. Till the very end? No, because I'm still Ismailov, in a Russian way, for example. So there are things like that, which are partly, for example, it's laziness, because too many documents are under the same name. Then the Western brand, Hamid Ismailov, appeared. So all of that, there are logistics of it as well. But I do understand they am still sort of carrying the traces of the Sovietization.
Thank you so much, Hamid. It was a fascinating conversation, and I really would like it to go on, but unfortunately, we have to finish. I encourage everyone to check out We Computers, the new novel, Ghazal novel by Hamid Ismailov. And thank you, Hamid, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for having me and being interested in my work. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.